Dr. Kitshe. I welcome you here to the Institute for the Humanities. I'm Susan Levine, the director, and we're very pleased today to be hosting our faculty fellow, Natasha Barnes. But before we get to the lecture, I have a few announcements that I'd like to make about upcoming events here at the Institute. Next week, on February 28th, one of our dissertation fellows, Smita Das, will be giving her lecture entitled Coolie, Narratives of Race, Labor, and Sexuality. And Smita is also from the English department. We also have two programs coming up in our 30th anniversary crisis series, that is, Crisis Through the Lens of the Humanities. Next week on February 7th, we're going to host historian Scott Nelson from the College of William and Mary, who is going to be talking about credit and trust. The title of his lecture is Who Do You Trust? Lessons from the Last 7 Financial Crises. And on March 6th, we're going to host Priscilla Wald from Duke University's English department in our academics episode. Her talk is entitled Outbreak, Contagion, Sensation, and the Obscure Geography of Poverty. So those are two very special events that we're going to be having in conjunction with the Institute's 30th anniversary. And I also want to mention two dates that you might want to save on your calendar. One is April 4th. Eric Schlosser, the author of Fast Food Nation, will be speaking on food justice and American injustice. And this is part of the Chancellor's Initiative in the Humanities with a focus on food studies. And on April 19th, Dipesh Chakrabarti will speak on climate change and the historical imagination. And that is part of our working group on publics, cultures, and practices of difference. So we have many other events, a number of brown bags and speakers coming up. You can look on our website to see all of these events. And this spring it's going to be a pretty busy season. Now I would like to introduce Nancy Cirillo, who is Professor Emerita from USC's English Department, and she will introduce Natasha.
I guess I should move, right?
And I'm safe behind your laptop. Good afternoon, and thank you all for coming. And I'd like to thank Susan and Linda for doing these wonderful afternoons for all of us. And thank you for inviting me to introduce Natasha. I'm going to start on a personal note very briefly. My first disagreement with Natasha took place at an English department colloquium. Natasha was new at UIC, and we had never met. We disagreed about the work of the Guyanese novelist Edgar Mittelholzer. But since we were arguably the only people in the room who had read the novels of Mittelholzer, much less heard of him, it was a brief interchange. It was enough, however, to provide all of us an insight into Natasha's quick and finely focused mind. For the record, Natasha's mother agrees with me about Mittelholzer. My second disagreement with Natasha was later and concerned the representation of the perpetrator prison guard in Bernhard Schlink's novel, The Reader. I knew Natasha much better then, and so I was prepared for the lively and exciting debate that took us into such significant byways as the question of retaliatory justice as against restorative justice, which led to the value of the Truth and Reconciliation projects, which brought us back to the Nuremberg trials, and so it went. Rich and memorable, as every intellectual encounter with Natasha is destined to be. Among the many things the foregoing list suggests, Natasha's work is the product of a kind of intellectual courage, a willingness to take on the truly difficult political and ethical issues of our time, and to do so most admirably with passion. Natasha's first book, Cultural Conundrums, Race, Gender, Nation, and the Making of Caribbean Cultural Politics, testifies to this. This is also abundantly clear in the subject of the book on which she is currently working, as is her engagement now in the crucial and significant field of museum scholarship. Natasha's book, In Progress, examines the complex ideological, political, and ethical issues that the public representation of painful, often criminal activities, in this case lynching, entails. Natasha's presentation today is based on her book in progress, Without Sanctuary, the story of a lynching photography exhibit. The book studies how a private collection of lynching photography in the form of unpublished postcards became the unlikely subject of a popular museum exhibit when a New York City gallery owner offered the Atlanta collector an opportunity to exhibit his collection. Hugely attended in New York City, this became the first of 7 exhibits mounted between 2000 and 2006. Styled as a biography of lynching photography collection and its public showings, Without Sanctuary claims that the lynching histories embedded in the collection were protean and contradictory, and the curatorial practice gave the exhibit an ideological character that was mainstream and oppositional at the same time. The exhibits received a considerable amount of media and public attention, including an official Senate apology for lynching violence. Finally, the exhibits became a site for remembrance, mourning, and redress for African American survivor communities. But Natasha speaks best for herself. Will you all join me in welcoming Natasha Barnes?
Thanks so much, Nancy. I did not know I was disagreeing with you that first time we met, but anyway. I've had a wonderful year here. Susan and Linda, thank you. It's also been difficult. I'm mourning the death of my sister who passed away last year in January, and I actually did not think I could ever be getting out of bed, far less standing here giving a talk a year later. So thanks for providing me with a way to get on my feet. I truly appreciate it, as well as my fellow colleagues who've made this year one that I can actually see myself working and breathing and moving on with life. So I want to talk today about death and about objects and about value and meaning. So I'll start. There's a gaslight gorgeousness about the objects in Steven Spielberg's movie Lincoln. I don't know if anybody has seen it. I'm sure a lot of us have. A film in which things become substitutes for ideas and people. In a slow-moving tale about the constitutional wrangling for the passage of the 13th Amendment, the film's action is supplied by its objects. Ink-dipped pens, beautifully carved oval blotters, rag paper with its charming uneven surfaces, handwritten letters elegantly scripted by generals and adjutants whose good penmanship never flags even in the heat of a bloody Civil War battle. When the camera pans around the chambers of administration, we are reminded of the aesthetic loveliness of commonplace and everyday items, the piles of documents covered in brown paper and held together with simple red cording ties that lie on those long mahogany desks at council meetings, the busy offices where well-thumbed, gilt-edged calfskin books tumble deliciously out of open bookshelves. The early telegraphing machines with its handsome copper polling in its New York Central Station-like interiors make the film a decorator's dream. Even the crumpled garments worn by the rapscallion W.E.B, the character who's as close to a villain as the film allows, gives him the kind of sartorial air that would have been approved of by the doyens of Queer Eye for the Straight Guy. Oh, those colorful, vegetable-dyed, hand-loomed, brocaded waistcoats are to die for. When Edward Stanton, there's a lot on here, I couldn't resist, sorry. When Edward Stanton, Lincoln's irascible war secretary, starts an important cabinet meeting with a complaint about a map, an edge of which has been burnt by candlelight, Lincoln humorously chides him by pointing out that the map, a mere representation of the land being fought for, is not the land itself, but Stanton will have none of it. This is the property of the United States government, he huffily retorts. An objection heard over the audience's muffled laughter over the muffled laughter of the audience, but our laughter is not a guffaw, because we know that the Secretary is not entirely wrong in his assertions about the value and ownership of tangible everyday things like maps that are meant to represent what for the Union leadership is as invaluable and precious as life itself, the land, the territorial integrity of the U.S. I'm also reading a recent book by James Oakes that talks about the fact that one of the major impetus for the Civil War was in fact territorial integrity. As the only republic in a sea of monarchical government, the breakup of the United States will signal not just a failed republican state, but a failed political idea. But let's go back to Stanton. But my point is that the Secretary of War is kind of onto something essential about the film's relationship with materiality, and is concerned that about the map replicates something of the fastidiousness and covetousness around objects that seem inseparable from the film's larger political and moral meanings. A bit of self-confession here. Any of us who shop for 19th century tchotchkes on eBay, or visit a charming vintage store in Andersonville, or thumb through the pages of restoration hardware know something about the symmetries of value between objects and what objects represent. In fact, if you looked at the list of credits at the end of the film, the libraries, I mean, they're almost as if the libraries were characters and producers themselves. It was amazing. Because many of us would kill for that map. That map is the thing itself, and it's precisely this calculus that's affirmed in the scene where Thaddeus Stevens, the real racial Democrat in this constitutional history, carefully folds the signed Emancipation Act and absconds with it back home to share it as a present with his black housekeeper. It's as if the reading and fondling of the handwritten document confers freedom itself. Who wouldn't want a piece of it? So my argument, and this ties into what I'm going to try to do with pictures at a museum, at an exhibit. Lincoln traffics in a guilty, self-indulgent aesthetic pleasure about things and their meaning, but like all guilty pleasures, it makes some wrong-headed symmetries about where value lies. African Americans will soon learn that the Declaration and the constitutional amendments that are to follow it are mere legal fictions. If this movie makes synecdoches of administrative documents and high-minded civic ideals, blacks know that the cornucopia of rights inscribed on these documents are literally not worth the paper they're written on. The film's opening scene with the black Civil War soldiers of the 2nd Kansas Colored Infantry who stab, who smash, who bayonet white rebel soldiers restores, only for an instant, the proper relationship between the tangible and then the ideal, that its bodies engaged in real life and death struggles that democratic transformations are born of. But my subject today are photographs and what photographs mean. And so the Civil War and Steven Spielberg's lush film, and I keep thinking about it because it's not lush and invitational in the way that Downton Abbey is. Are you rewatching that? There's something about the way you can see these things around you. There's just, it's amazing. You know, one doesn't really want a teaspoon that is, a grapefruit spoon in Downton Abbey, but you kind of want that blotter that Lincoln uses every time he prepares his correspondence out for folding. It's extraordinary. So the Civil War in Steven Spielberg's decorous film, ostensibly about the Civil War, is as good a place as any to start. This period was the first time that enslaved African Americans were pictured in the new technology, in a new epoch of historical time, and certainly in the replica of the guerrilla tactics that they used to advance the Union cause as Northern battalions invaded the South. Many blacks used the camera and the nation's sudden interest in them for their own kind of self-fashioning. And of course, there's this great, wonderful book by Ronald Coddington called African American Faces of the Civil War. It just came out that speaks to that. They're just wonderful images of soldiers, many of them quote-unquote contraband, the things, the property of the South that becomes seized upon and used. There's a whole section I have on contraband in there. Okay, let me go on. The artifactual aura of a film that's about African Americans but is emptied of them, photographs of blacks, both as slaves and contraband recruits to the Union Army, capture some of the themes of my talk. So that when we find little Tad Lincoln asleep on the floor very early in the movie, surrounded by a bounty of things, a lavish Persian rug, strewn with toy metal soldiers, there's something there as well. There's a glass plate negative of a slave boy, about the same age as Tad, with a price tag of $600 written on the margins. Now, the choice of the glass plate negative, part of a group of images as the film goes on that are elaborately, they're in a mahogany box and you slot them in. And we hear Lincoln say they're on loan from his famous White House photographer, Alexander Gardner. They're part of what I'm seeing as the sort of curatorial excess of the film that make nonsense of the social life of Lincoln's household, but are offered to us as a kind of tangle of illusory signifiers. So what do I mean by that? It's not unusual for Northern householders to actually have pictures of contraband and actually put them in their family album. I'll talk about that a little bit. But you wouldn't have a 9-year-old boy playing with a glass plate negative. The glass plate negatives are something completely different. That's what a photographer has in his or her studio, from which the carte de visites, the cheaper paper pieces, are made from. So it's like your kids might be playing with an iPhone or an iPad on the floor, but they won't be playing with an Apple Lisa, that prototype, the first computer that Steve Jobs ever made that actually now goes for $10,000 on the internet or become collector's item. That's the equivalent. So it makes me wonder, when we see these glass plate negatives, what exactly are we to see in these things? A rare and beautiful photographer's studio artifact, or the souls of black folk? And the price tag. In the calculus of value, commerce, and desire that the film traffics in, exactly what value is signified by the $600 price tag? Is it, what does the $600 buy? The young African-American enslaved boy, or this gorgeous wood-framed glass plate negative for which $600 would be a steal in today's white-hot Civil War collector's market? So look at your handbook, because around that handout, around the time I troll eBay, okay? And we have an image of one of these contraband photographs, and that if you read, it's incredibly rare, and there's so much to do with that photograph. These children are from New Orleans. One very dark, the other one white, so black but so white that so fair-skinned that she appears white. These are the typical spectacles of 19th century fashioning of black people. And it's actually produced, if you turn around at the back, by a union officer who's actually selling them and making for charity for black. Now, many Northerners would have these things in their collections. They would actually put them in their albums. But I want you to look at the price tag that sold for, and the reserve was not met. I've been trying to communicate with this seller called Junk Snapper Bob. Every week I send him an email, see if he'll talk to me. But that went for over $1,200, and I asked him if he sold it, and he did sell it to someone. And you kind of wonder, where has it gone? I've never seen one of these. I'm trying to track down others. But it's telling you something about the voracious appetite for these images, the cash nexus, as well as what does one do? What does one do? I don't know if I'm ever going to hold on to those handouts. That might be the last I can see of them. I'm trying to get the owner to at least allow me copyright or to publish it. I've not heard, but that's the thing. It's paid for and it disappears into private collections. Okay. So from Lincoln, I want to turn to another historical moment and another important historical figure, and the setting is just as cinematic, but without a Steven Spielberg or a Quentin Tarantino or a Spike Lee to record it. And it's about W.E.B. Du Bois and the complicated racial space of turn-of-the-century Atlanta, where the scholar began his academic career at Atlanta University in the city's Black Southwest community. Du Bois inhabited a city that literalized the famous metaphor he coined to describe Black modernity in a racial climate, alternatively liberated by the letter of slavery. I mean, this is the world post the film Lincoln, where the freedoms are bestowed and given. So Du Bois has to negotiate the systems of that and the systems of legal disenfranchisement, but open to new modalities of oppression dictated by the function of liberal capitalism. Life as Atlanta's most erudite, classically educated scholar in a city that was violently resegregating its institutions and public spaces was truly a life lived between the veil. Situated some 2 miles from the burgeoning metropolitan center, Atlanta University was no longer, quote, the green island in the dull Red Sea, as James Weldon Johnson's narrator lovingly described it in Autobiography of an Ex-Colored Man, unless the descriptor characterized the two racial worlds that Du Bois angrily negotiated. One critical afternoon in 1899, Du Bois was taking a familiar walk downtown, the 5-mile walk to the elegant commercial area of the city that was one that middle-class African Americans preferred to make on foot rather than patronize the Jim Crow streetcars paid for by public money, but manned by rowdy and racist right conductors who took a particular delight in roughing up well-dressed uppity Negroes whenever they stepped on the streetcar. Du Bois was on his way to a portentous meeting with Joel Chandler Harris. He was a famous white Southern author of known most prominently today as the author of the Uncle Remus tales. And he was at the time editor of Atlanta's main journal, newspaper, the Atlanta Journal-Constitution. And Du Bois was delivering a petition of protest about the lynching of a black laborer, and he was also prepared to discuss the race question with a grand old Southerner who held liberal, if paternalistic, sympathies towards African Americans. Scholars are unsure about what happened next on this walk. Either Du Bois passed by and witnessed a storefront of a white-owned drugstore that displayed the grisly, severed knuckles of the black Georgian, Sam Hose, the victim of the 1899 Spectre Tortugal lynching, who was the subject of the petition Du Bois was carrying uptown, or Du Bois was told by onlookers on the street that if you go down, you're going to see Sam Hose's knuckles pickled in a mason jar. Whatever the story is, Du Bois went back home and didn't meet Harris. He abandoned his journey and terminated a meeting that many of us feel could have changed race relations in the city for the rest of the century. He wrote about this later. How could I be a cool, detached scientist while Negroes were lynched, murdered, and starved? Du Bois fumed angrily in his autobiography. A mere 7 years later, Du Bois would find himself on a torturous train ride, hurrying back to his home from a research sojourn in Alabama, on the news that the city was ablaze in a murderous race riot. Frantic with worry about the safety of his wife and young daughter, Du Bois composed what one biographer called the phosphorescent lines of a prose poem, Litany at Atlanta. If racial terror girded the emotional and scholarly potential of Du Bois's genius, forcing his reluctant transformation from academic to activist, emptying his psychic self of its potential for full domestic joy, emotionally open professional and collegial relationships, trust in human camaraderie regardless of its racial face. Atlanta was the scene of Du Bois's nightmare. I'm talking today about the Atlanta Without Sanctuary exhibition. It's an exhibition and a larger collection of lynching photographs that I have been involved with for the last 13 years, and they've literally changed my life. I've been a witness and sometimes an erstwhile custodian of this collection of photographs that found its way in 2000 into a book and into a series of companion museum exhibits. And the focus of my talk is a third showing of what we now have learned to call the Without Sanctuary collection. It was shown in Atlanta in 2000. It was the first time this exhibition was launched in the South. Without Sanctuary at the time was a collection of lynching photographs. Lynching photographs. I didn't know what that was. These photographs were mostly in postcard form, and it was a critical part of the cultural sociology of lynching violence. Mechanically produced images of lynching victims, almost always depicting dead, broken black bodies surrounded by perpetrators smiling of various kinds, women, men, children, white onlookers mostly, came into wide usage as a supplement to the practice of souvenir collecting that was common to lynching bees. It was pretty frequent, common, in early lynchings for perpetrators to slice body parts of black victims as mementos, fingers, toes, testicles, hence Sam Hose's knuckles in the Atlanta drugstore window in 1899. But as spectacle lynchings became larger and more organized, photography became the logical modern substitute for a piece of the action. Photographers would set up mobile studios, very much like the mobile studios that they used in the Civil War to record battlefields and make heroic carte de visites of handsome black and white servicemen at lynching sites, selling the postcards for 5 or 10 cents a piece. It was a very easy and lucrative way for a local town photographer in a sleepy little district to drum up the business of a lifetime. Many of them made a killing. So the collection was a brainchild of a Florida-born Atlanta resident, James Allen, a man who described his professional labor as that of a picker. Work that he described in the afterword of the book that he published, which he says he traveled, labor, he says, that consists of traveling country roads in my home state of Georgia, acquiring things that I thought were telling, handmade furniture and slave-made pots and pieced quilt top and carved walking sticks, end quote. This was in 2000, before we had reality shows on History Channel called American Pickers, or you can watch PBS Market Warriors. But pickers are people who, do we know who picker? Do I have to explain who they are? They're not antiques, they dumpster dive. They go, and Jimmy would, who we affectionately call Jimmy, would drive into the back roads of Georgia and go into people's homes and be very polite and knock on the door and said, "Ma'am, I'm looking for stuff. Can you take me in and show me what you got?" And they'd talk and they'd share a bourbon and he'd make relationships and he'd go through all the things that they thought of as junk and see amazing stuff, slave-made quilts, pots. There's a lot to be said about this labor of picking. In fact, if you read carefully on the handout, I think that Junk Snapper Dad, or whatever he is, he's a picker too. He describes, this comes from an attic, a New Hampshire attic, a chest in a New Hampshire attic. It was probably something he was about to throw away. He goes in and he discovers gold. So that's what pickers do, okay? It's a picker's work to discern what's telling, that's a word Jim Allen used, in the bric-a-brac of American material culture, to get it cheap and to sell it high. Now, James Allen is my friend, in fact, one of my closest friends. And my involvement with him in the exhibit means coming to terms both with his genius as a public historian and archivist, a man with no formal university education whose unschooled intelligence and itinerant interests gave birth to a fascinating lynching photography collection and the scorched history it pictured. But just saying those three words, lynching photography collection, still gives me pause. Because what other sensibility but that cultivated by a picker could seize upon these postcard images, the disjecta membra of America's Jim Crow legacy, and discover value in their scenes of ordinary domestic terror? Jimmy, as we affectionately call him, is a cauldron of complex and contradictory instinct and motivation. He's both a courtly Southern gentleman and a brilliant raconteur, funny as hell, in the best Southern tradition. But was also at the time a 50-year-old white gay man from a prominent and devoutly Catholic Irish family who abandoned him when he came out. He was a member of ACT UP in Atlanta in the 80s when his friends were dying of AIDS in Southern hospitals, shunned not only by their family, but by the medical professions. And that gave Jimmy the fierceness and zealotry that he cultivated for the things he championed. So he could be Faulkneresque in his charm, and he can tell a great Southern tale. That's very essential. Hi, Travell, thanks for coming. It's one of my favorite students. He could tell a marvelous tale. And part of being a picker and doing this work is the whole interpretive labor of saying what the value is. So Jimmy could do that, but he was also fiercely independent and publicly truculent when crossed. So he could be a Julian Assange when he wanted to. And now I'm going to talk about this explosive mix for the Atlanta exhibition, where we've got Jimmy Allen, the private collector, who has made friends with a librarian, Randall Burkett, who is a great, wonderful guy, a special collections in the library. Randall Burkett is like a gadfly. I mean, many people in the world of African American history know him. He was one of the first African Americanist PhDs. He's white. He actually worked and was the sort of director of Skip Gates's Harvard Center, and he knows everybody and is incredibly charming. And what you do as a librarian, trying to get, one of the things Randall always used to say, the first thing I do when I wake up is open up the obituaries. I want to see who died so you can get stuff, right? He wants to get people's stuff, okay? So Jimmy and Randall got together and they formed friendships, and out of these sort of private negotiations, when the book was published in 2000, Jimmy had put the documents on long-term loan in Emory University's special collections. So Emory University Library was fielding all the calls for, this exhibit when it became public. I'll talk about that in a minute. They were, because answering phone calls from museum professionals who had to have them. There was a sort of close, but essentially private, itinerant, casual relationship. So Randall Burkett, so I'm going to talk now about how an exhibit that Emory sponsors sort of comes out of this mix. There were at least three major players in the exhibition process whose competing visions about the character and logistics of an Atlanta showing of the lynching photographs quickly came to loggerheads. Firstly, the collection from which the exhibit was to be formed, I've just said that, had a private owner. That's Jimmy Allen. And James had a keenly honed ideological and political investment that he'd built up over the years for the importance of the collection and the kinds of counter-discursive work that its showing must perform. For Allen, Without Sanctuary was a grueling 10-year project to ferret out photographic evidence, and he used this word all the time, of a history of domestic violence that had been suppressed by the larger culture. And while it's true that some lynching photographs have public resonance, for example, the Emmett Till lynching, what's important about Alan's collection is that it's the sheer volume, the sheer mountain of postcards and images that it's the catalog it makes of lynching violence as an ordinary, everyday terroristic practice. So nothing is more explosive about Without Sanctuary for Jimmy than this essential theme. The collection's primary semiotics is in its value as a powerful indictment of America and its history of sadistic violence against a disenfranchised black populace. Photograph after photograph, Without Sanctuary tells a story about terror in the racial making of modern America, where black victims are caught in the vicissitudes of white mob violence and were without protection and without redress. White perpetrators and the civic and social institutions they acted in concert with were without mercy, their violence was without restraint, and the repercussions of their terror were without sanction. This is Jimmy's vision. Of the many stories that an exhibition of lynching photography can be made to tell, Alan saw the collection as primarily motivated to prioritize this one. Also, Alan, and I'm going to show you a few of the photographs through this little movie here. Alan also turned out to be a perfect spokesman for not just the images and his stories about collecting, but what they mean. You know, in literature, many of our Raymond Williams, we have language to talk about literary exegesis as the commonplace, the commonsensical readings. I don't know if we have an equivalent in history, but Jimmy was very good at talking about the way a lynching victim was treated in the 19th century and its relevance today. He had that. He did it like nobody else, and I'm going to show some excerpts. So let me first show a movie that he made, and I hope this can.
14 men rode into Oklahoma Lake, and
It might be a bit too loud.
The New York Times reported that the victims were tortured with knives before being discarded corpses hung for public display in front of a blacksmith. You did the work of men today, and your deeds will resound in every state, village, and hamlet.
I am a picker. It is my living and my avocation. I search out items that some people don't want or need, and then sell them to others who do. In America, everything is for sale, even a national shame. Until I came upon a postcard of a lynching, postcards seemed trivial to me, the way second-hand, misshapen Rubbermaid products might seem now. Ironically, the pursuit of these images has brought to me a great sense of purpose and personal satisfaction. Studying these photographs has engendered in me a caution of whites, of the majority, of the young, of religion, of the accepted. Perhaps a certain circumspection concerning these things was already in me, but surely not as actively as after the first sight of a brittle postcard of Leo Frank dead in an oak tree. It wasn't the corpse that bewildered me as much as the canine thin faces of the pack, lingering in the woods, circling after the kill. Hundreds of flea markets later, a trader pulled me aside and in conspiratorial tones offered to sell me a real photo postcard. It was Lord Nelson, hanging from a bridge, caught so pitiful and tattered and beyond retrieving, like a paper kite snagged on a utility wire. That image of Laura layered a pall of grief over all my fears. I believe the photographer was more than a perceptive spectator at lynchings. Too often they compulsively composed silvery tableaux, nature morte, positioning and lighting corpses as if they were game birds shot on the wing. Indeed, the photographic art played as significant a role in the ritual as torture or souvenir grabbing, creating a sort of two-dimensional biblical swine, a receptacle for a collective sinful self. Lust propelled the commercial reproduction and distribution of the images, facilitating the endless replay of anguish. Even dead, the victims were without sanctuary.
Okay, so that's one thing he made, but I want
These
to...
photographs
Oh, sorry.
provoke a strong
Sorry.
sense of denial in me and a desire to freeze my emotions. In time, I realize that my fear of the other is fear of myself. Then these portraits, torn from other family albums, become the portraits of my own family and of myself. And the faces of the living and the faces of the dead recur in me and in my daily life. I've seen John Richards alone on a remote county road, rocking along in hobby horse strides, head low, eyes to the ground, spotting coins or rocks or roots. And I've encountered Laura Nelson in a small, sturdy woman who answered my knock on a back porch door. In her deep-set eyes, I watched a silent crowd parade across a shiny steel bridge, looking down. And on Christmas Lane, just blocks from our home, I've observed another Leo, a small-framed boy with his shirt tail out and skull cap off-center, as he made his way to Sabbath prayers. With each encounter, I can't help thinking of these photos, and the march of time, and of the cold steel trigger in the human heart.
I'm going to show, so this is one thing he made, but Jimmy was spellbinding. He would talk to people. And David Blight, who's now at Yale, befriended him. I mean, he just had a way of explaining and talking to people that was really important. I'm going to show you another aspect of this. When he was on C-SPAN, an interview on C-SPAN, that long interview call-in show, that in 2005, after the Senate apology for lynching. So let me see if I can first play this, and then I'm going to...
Right now, he's the editor and co-author of Without Sanctuary, Lynching Photography in America. This is the cover of the book, and he's our guest. Welcome.
Thank you.
This week took an act.
Oh, no.
What did they do?
No, I tried to...
Passed a non-binding
Sorry.
resolution apologizing, but never having...
I tried to edit this. I don't want this to...
incredibly brutal.
Wait.
Columbus, South Carolina.
Yes, sir.
No, hold on.
Well, that the consciousness of
Hold on, just a second.
Savannah, Georgia. You're next.
That's it.
Good morning.
Good morning.
My name is Willie Seymour. I'm calling from Savannah, Georgia, and I had a chance recently to go out to Mississippi. There are places now in Mississippi. There are places now, parts of in the Gulf out there. This kind of stuff continues on. I'd like to commend you on taking this stand to bringing this to the forefront. But thank C-SPAN for bringing this also, because I once recently was watching C-SPAN and they were talking about the Constitution of the United States of America. And they had all these bronze statues of all the constitutionals who wrote it. They were writing the Constitution then. And at the time, America embarked that all whites were given the right to catch all slaves. It was deputized every white person in the United States one time to catch blacks if they didn't have a pass and hang them. To bring this to the forefront now, to talk about restitution of part of history that has been literally wiped out, literally just wiped out, no one wants to talk about, because when you talk about that, why are you bringing this up now? A caller just said, what party are you affiliated with? It doesn't matter a party that you're affiliated with, a human right. We cannot go. Myself, in 1965, I left Savannah, Georgia, headed to Philadelphia, Pennsylvania on a bus. When I got to the bus terminal in D.C., the lady told me that I could not eat a sandwich with me and my sister. And we had to go around the back of the bus terminal. We got 2 bags of cookies, and I got 2 canned drinks when we got back on the bus. I could not eat in the restaurant in the capital of the United States of America.
Caller, thank you. Mr. Allen.
At the exhibit in New York City, when the photographs were first put up, a sailor came up to me, about 30 years old. He was here in D.C. on leave, and the pictures of Frank Embry in the book, who was made to pose, naked, stripped, whipped, just lashed from head to toe, front and back photographs, and acts of humiliation beyond the American imagination, and he broke down in tears in front of those photographs because here in the city of Washington, D.C., he was stripped, searched in front of a large crowd. It's an African-American sailor. Stripped in front of a large crowd at rush hour, sidewalks full, surrounded by police. And those are painful moments that will never leave the person's consciousness, and will leave this question of why being asked over and over, always unresolved.
One of the people in your book, one of the people at the conference call, but it was James Cameron.
Okay, so I'll stop it here.
He was to be taken and killed along with 2
Sorry.
older acquaintances.
I was at that Senate, I was at Apology, and I was able to meet James Cameron. Okay. So I wanted to show that to people to get a real sense of how he was able to do the interpreting and explaining. The ease that he had with people of all walks of life. To listen to him sometimes was like sort of being in the thralls of the ancient mariner. I mean, you simply couldn't move. He was a perfect spokesperson for this collection. At the same time, though, interpretation is part of the work of a picker. Interpretation and explaining the value, the importance, is part of what you do as a picker who buys and who sells. So wanted to give a sense of who he was and how he negotiated the public. So so let's go back to the exhibition. So you've got Jimmy Allen. Maybe I should turn this off now or put this down. I don't think that would work. So at Emory University, the exhibition's main partnering institution, such a pointed history of domestic racial violence was not an easy theme to claim. So I've skipped out a bit. First of all, he published this book called Without Sanctuary, which some people, as another friend of mine, has seen. Okay, the book was published by a small publishing outfit, Twin Palms Publishers in Santa Fe. They published art books, and there was a kind of art history quality to this. And I've had lots of people say, well, why did he do this? He did this for the same reason he collected those things. He didn't there weren't any takers for this. This was 2000. Who was going to publish a book simply of lynching photographs? People felt he made money off of this. He didn't get an advance. There are friends of mine who've gotten huge advances for books that turned out to be much less important. Everything Jimmy did, because he was not part of the academy or the book publishing, were done through private, one-to-one negotiations. Somebody put in with the publisher here. He got a few people, including Leon Litwack, to write a couple forewords. John Lewis wrote a foreword. Everything was done by these private negotiations, simply because he wasn't institutionally minded in that way. He wasn't part of our publishing or academic circles. And, but at the same time, these books took on a life of their own. Leon Litwack, who I'm actually going to interview, he's invited me to his home in Palo Alto for a couple of days. Leon Litwack talked about going to Oakland when the book came out and addressing a major, working class African American audience, and every single one of them bought this $40 book. Okay, so it's a fascinating history. The first exhibit was literally a friend who owned a photographer's gallery just said, "Do you want to put them up in my gallery?" He said, "Sure." So the pictures are just stuck on the walls of a gallery. And all of a sudden, it became covered by the press. It was a January, one of the coldest Januaries that New York had remembered. And there were people lining up because there was a fire code that said only 60 people at a time could be. So folks were lining up to see these pictures in the gallery. Stevie Wonder who's blind, came to the exhibit. Quentin Tarantino came and actually wanted to, some of the photographs, and was thinking of, God forbid now that we've seen, thinking of making a movie. So he gives them to Quentin Tarantino, and they fell out because Jimmy is Jimmy. They fell out because Quentin Tarantino was acting like a diva, and he phones Quentin and says, "Give me back my stuff." And Quentin Tarantino sends an overnight FedEx with all the photographs and a one-word letter saying, "Here." It was great. Jimmy framed it. So so this is the kind of thing, and then it went to the New York Historical Society based on the success of this this exhibit, sort of impromptu, sort of guerrilla exhibit in a gallery. Jimmy curated that exhibition himself. They really didn't have the staff. He put them up. He spent hours of his time and talked to people. It sort of evolved that way. So remember, Emory University now is the official custodian, and so in 2000 in the early 2001, there's discussion about let's bring it finally to the South. Let's show this. So for Emory University, the exhibition's main partnering institution, such a pointed history of domestic racial violence was not an easy theme to claim. As an institution of the Old South, nestled in Atlanta's picturesque Druid Hills neighborhood, that was a backdrop to Beresford's Driving Miss Daisy. I used to work there at Emory, whose, quote, mile and mile of 9-inch water mains and sewers, the sociologist Du Bois railed at the turn of the century, was, quote, wrung from the taxes out of poor blacks and whites, while there's no city water for Atlanta's 5,000 black children. So this is the kind of neighborhood that Emory is in. Emory had a long and uneven history reconciling its elite antebellum, slave-owning Southern Methodist cultural past with its new identity as a liberal, multiracial educational arm of the present. With the arrival of the 1980s, there was an extraordinary, I think it was the single largest endowment ever given to a university by Coca-Cola's Woodruff family. It was another prominent family. And it actually was the single largest financial endowment ever bestowed on an American university. Emory was able to use the influx of cash to transform itself into a major academic player without radically upsetting the ideological values of the old guard. Among its many other achievements, Woodruff money eased the hiring of distinguished black faculty throughout the university and enabled the offering of generous scholarships to African American undergrads, which would have been difficult to broker without fractious ideological and fiscal battles over the changing nature of the university. But recent cultural wars within the halls of the university showed the unevenness of these competing identities. In the late 1990s, the university was forced into a controversial decision to expel one of what they call the heritage fraternities. These are these Southern, where they sort of dress up as Rhett Butler and Scarlett, so they had to throw them off the campus. Which was a source of public tension within the university and the larger Atlanta alumni community. Although Emory's status as a private university shielded although Emory's status as a private university shielded the institution from the more public desegregation battles that plagued the University of Georgia in the 60s, many Black Atlantans have long-standing memories of Emory's history of genteel racial exclusiveness. In fact, one of my colleagues, who was actually on the faculty committee member, we formed a committee to sort of broker this exhibition. Theophilus Smith, an African-American tenured professor in the religion department, told me that his father in the 50s wrote to the president of Emory University that had a law school, because Thee's father had a young family and wanted to get a law degree. And the president of the university wrote him back saying, "Not now, not ever will Emory College ever have a Negro law student." But we don't see this on Eyes on the Prize because they're private and they could shield this history. So this schizophrenic history, the cultural heritage of course, many elite American universities, Northern or Southern, produced the paradox from which Emory's involvement in Without Sanctuary was going to stem. The vast reserves of cultural and material capital that qualified the university as Atlanta's premier educational institution, they like to call themselves the Harvard of the North, ha ha ha, and the one perhaps best place to broker the region's first Southern showing of a racially sensitive exhibition was an inheritance accrued to Emory through its elite segregated past. How much time do I have? There's just so much here. Oh, really? Okay. See, this is a problem. I wanted to talk about the nature of the city as well. So maybe I'll talk about Atlanta and why this exhibition was so controversial. Atlanta, too, in spite of the fact that it had a rich civil rights history, somehow was able to shield itself from the worst images of that history. Of course, it was the birthplace of Dr. King and many of the leaders of the civil rights movement, but all of the real action, the brutality, took place in Alabama, in Selma, in Mississippi. So Atlanta wanted to and city managers saw itself as a city on the remake, and it sort of turned its back again, shielded itself from that civil rights history with these sort of mantras of going forward. They like to call themselves a city too busy to hate. So the notion of this sort of commercial hum that we don't have time to hate. So that the exhibition now, which is going to have partners with Emory, its alumni, and the Atlanta History Center, was going to come into loggerheads, eagerly covered by the press. So this is the rest of my paper. There's a lot to talk about. This comes from a chapter that's now almost 200 pages, but I'm just wondering what to do, if I should go on. Do people want to know about what happened at the Atlanta, or should I just open it up to? I'm sorry, this is not what I envisioned, but this happens.
Tell us what happened in the loggerhead in the fight.
What had happened is that Emory University, and I have to be careful. I'm serious. I do have to. This is being taped, and I was, the Emory University decided, and actually I really should talk about that because I think it has relevance to our world today and our institution today. Emory wanted to bring faculty on board, but we have to remember that this came to the university through administrators. So you've got Randall Burkett, who goes to the provost of the university at the time, Rebecca Chop, who, a woman who in the last 15 years has had these many titles: Dean of Yale Divinity School, Provost of Emory University, President of Colgate University, now President of Swarthmore College. I'm saying that to say that we've got these high-powered executives who are making decisions and are not involving faculty. And so that Randall Burkett goes to Rebecca Chop, who is going to be leaving in a year or two, we don't know that. All of these people are on the make, goes to the president of the university, let's have the exhibition. The faculty are feeling beleaguered. They refuse to get involved. The The serfs, like me, I got involved. I wasn't even an African Americanist at the time. There were two, the main faculty, the main department was the most underfunded department who helped. That was African American Studies. It wasn't even a department. It was an underfunded program filled with untenured and unaffiliated faculty. I was part of this. I spent my last tenure year working valiantly in a committee meeting where the president would look at me and say, Natasha, would you do this? And at the end of that year, I was denied tenure. It's a very interesting and difficult history about, how universities do this kind of racial work. Yeah.
Did the administration say, no, we don't want it?
No, they wanted it, but they wanted to do it, but this was going to be hard. So Chase and Rebecca Chop says, well, in these typical, I need to be careful, let's get some black faculty involved in this. So they go to really one of the most senior black faculty members of the English department, Frances Smith Foster, who basically at a cocktail party said, well, it sounds interesting, but let's talk to other black people about it. And that was the last thing she had to do with it. So it was a fascinating moment. We organized oral histories. We went out and organized town hall meetings at Emory, at sort of black cultural centers, and at what was to be our partnering center, the Atlanta History Museum, a kind of history museum that was really about sort of Civil War and Gone with the Wind. And we put together town halls and speak outs that were televised, and it was a wonderful experience, but Emory was at the same time afraid of, was very conscious of its public history and was afraid. So, you could go now and look at those town hall meetings on video in Auburn Avenue Library, but if you wanted a transcript, the transcripts came back marked property of Emory University. So if I wanted to quote from them, and I actually have been threatened, that's illegal, even though I was part of this. So it was a very complicated story, and it's a story about institutions, about the difficulty of this, what it means to have race-themed exhibits in quote-unquote white institutions, the whole gamut, yeah.
I'm just wondering whether there's just a basic psychological mechanism of repression. That when something's as painful as this material, and you're African American, and you're part of a kind of academy, and you're partaking in this liberal culture which we're in, I think there is, I'm just trying to psychologize it a bit, a desire to say, let's block all this out, we've moved on, things are okay now, at least if we're, professors in the academy, and not have to address this. Do you think there's an element of that?
Yes.
Apart from institutional politics?
Yeah, there was that.
And I'll give you an example, kind of analogous example from my own experience, but this is, kind of about pain and shame, really, and humiliation. A few years ago, because I work a lot on anti-Semitism in the Middle Ages, and the paper I was working on, which had a lot to do with the imagery of excrement, and Jews would become associated with excrement, which is there. It's just there. I work with primary texts, And I was invited to give a talk in the Jewish Studies department at a certain university I won't specify. And the gentleman wrote back, who's Jewish himself, and said, we can't have you giving talks about, Jews and shooting in the Middle Ages. And I wrote back and said, well, I see the pain of it, I see the awkwardness of it, but this is truth. This is what was represented. Yeah. And, I think there's a real problem with sanitizing this kind of material. I really do. Whether it's this kind of thing or whether it's representations of Jews in the Middle Ages.
Yeah, and just to answer that real quickly, that Jimmy sort of showed it in that spirit, that this needs to be. But African Americans too, and this is what I'm looking at, they had a complicated relationship with this as well. Some people didn't want to see this because it's painful, but and that's what I was concerned about. You're going to have an exhibition. I got involved because you're going to have an exhibition. Suppose somebody sees their grandfather. Who is going to curate this? How is it going to be handled? Is it going to be turned into another kind of spectacle? But that was where I became turned around, because I was going to those meetings, I was following Jimmy around, and I saw what I never thought I would see. African Americans came up to Jimmy and said, "Do you know anything about my great-grandfather's lynching? I have no information." And that was remarkable. So the exhibit, with all of its quirks and its weirdness and its coverage in the paper, where Jimmy was calling the president of the Emory University a racist, and Rick Baird, and they calling him back. I mean, it was like, the Housewives of Atlanta at one point, That was the value in it. There were African American families who've been lynched who had their family reunions there at that site. It literally became a portal for their pain, for talking about this, and it was incredibly transformative. And that is why I'm still involved in it. Nancy, did you want to, you had your hand up? I know you have your hand up.
I can't resist. As curator of the Atlantic Slave Trade Collection at a public urban university in the supposed liberal confines of Chicago, I want to just have some quick anecdotes. The first is the designer hired by the library to set the whole exhibit up was a very well-known designer here in Chicago who was designed for the Library of Congress, so she knew what she was talking about. Her first response at our first meeting was, "I'm here to tell you that slavery exhibits don't do very well." I said, "Why?" And she said, "Too contentious."
That's very common in the museum. That's it. So can you imagine this?
We had a very interesting thing happen with her now. Maybe it's good because they paid her so well, or maybe because she had a transformative experience that many of us did, working with these extraordinary documents that we have. In the middle of the thing, she said, "This is fantastic," and she put together a very, very exciting design.
Yeah.
So that was very interesting, but something more, and I want to talk about this institution. We were looking for money, since it takes a lot of money
that's the other
to do
thing.
that, okay? Just to conserve the documents in the exhibit took thousands and thousands of dollars, so we were looking for money, because we couldn't exhibit those documents without conservation.
Yeah.
So we met with 4 people called advancement officers. I'm waiting for your laughter in the room.
Well, we met with some of them at Emory too.
Oh, okay, good luck. There were 10 people at that conference table involved in this, 10 white people. And we listened to 4 advancement officers on every level of this administration who told us that there would be, quote, and I'm quoting, it's burned into my mind, no interest in the city in a project like this.
They say that all the time.
Did they explain why? Did they try to justify that statement?
Yes, they did. In a way. Well, we don't have relationships with places that they just fund what they tell us they're interested in. Like we talked about craft.
Yeah. If you put a quilt exhibition, geez, Ben. I mean, it's serious. This is exactly how they talk.
And don't upset them.
Yeah,
Don't
yeah.
tell them that you're doing something like that.
Right.
I would like to add, I
Go
don't
on,
think
Sam.
that the university has been particularly aggressive about pushing this exhibit, which, by the way, is in process now of being designated World Heritage Sites by UNESCO. So the university either didn't want to do this, can't get itself together enough to do this, to present it to the city as an important project in this area. So I'm sorry.
Yeah, no, that's fine. And in fact, the sort of kind of opposite impulse happened. President Chase wanted to do it, but he has no experience, and he has no scholar, and he wanted to micromanage it.
Okay.
I'm serious. I mean, this is on film, and there's still a lot of bad blood. Jimmy took out everything from the exhibition. That's why I said there were times when the Field Museum was writing me, asking me, can you believe the Field Museum sent me an email saying they wanted to have Without Sanctuary at the Field? I followed up. I never got it. Yeah.
So what is the status of the collection now? What is Emory's relationship to that collection? I mean,
The honeymoon is gone, the romance is broken.
Right.
Emery has nothing to do, and had I been able to explain, is at one point things were going so slowly, but Jimmy doesn't understand that we academics, we do take a while, that he actually went to the National Park Service and Martin Luther King Historical Site and actually brokered a deal with them saying the exhibition will be here, that he hired a curator and basically presented it after 2 years of consultation to the president and said, I'm doing this. At one point he even said, I could put these on a bus, and I'm doing it, do you want to be on board? And so they said yes, and they sort of turned out to be a funding apparatus. But the stories of that were almost Dickensian about Emory is obsessively concerned about its image. I mean, this recent thing in the New York Times about the working class, I mean, they are still, wringing out their head. That is not a story, more so than any institution I've ever been to. They are Southern, they are sensitive, they have this history, and they hate bad publicity. So, I kind of wish President Chick, but then the other thing is, we would not have, I'm sorry, is that Matthew?
Could you, going back to the exhibit, could you talk about choices in terms of captioning the photographs, the presentation of photographs, the whole physicality of the exhibit?
Yeah. That again, I mean, I had to learn like Nancy about designers and all the things that go into it. The Atlanta exhibit was a really well-designed and well-curated exhibit. Curatorial practices. Joseph Jordan did it. He was actually the president of the Auburn Avenue Library. He now runs a center at UNC Chapel Hill. And what he decided to do is to give it a funerary kind of, so all the walls are black. And there were, Jimmy's one stipulation about these photographs is that they're not to be blown up. You've got to show them. Many of them are very small. They're postcard size. That was the one thing he said, that in terms of when he loaned this to different institutions. So there was a kind of funerary aspect to it. Now, they also prepared a kind of film that one saw in the anteroom. So the actual exhibition space, it was beautiful, but it was only about the size of this. So you couldn't, and only about 20 people could go in at one time. So what you do is you buy your ticket for a very small amount. You go into a small room where you're given a short movie. And it's a beautiful short movie. You're in a darkened room. You hear a bit about the history of lynching, and then you walk through and you see the images.
Sorry to interrupt, Natasha. Who made where did the movie?
The movie came from, just like what Nancy's saying, Joseph Jordan just said, I need to hire people, because if they had to wait for Emory University to, well, I'm going to prove, you can only drink 2 Cokes on. They just presented Emory with bills, okay? Which Emory, because that was the deal. When President Chase said, yes, I'll go along with you, they basically assented to being the funding apparatus. And then they were struck with all, because it takes a lot of money.
So the movie was made for the...
Was made specifically for that exhibition. It's never been shown since. And I
Where is it?
Probably property of Emory. You could see it, property of Emory University, and it probably is not online. I know it's not online. You're going to have to go into special collections and beg someone to show it to you, which they may or may not do. I mean, I don't, this is a sore point for...
And where was it shown? What building?
It was shown in the Martin Luther King historical site. It's in Atlanta, and it's the National Park Service. It's right across from the Kings, Coretta Scott Kings. So it's across the street, and it's the National Park Service sort of monument to Dr. King. They'd never had exhibitions at that time. And the other thing I write about is that the mainly African-American staff were literally about to, the day before the exhibition opened, were literally about to go on a warpath. They did not want that exhibition. Again, speaking to top-down managerial styles, preparing your staff in public. Rick Baird, one of the people who sort of fell out, said something that I thought was really important. When he spoke to the press, this is after Rick Baird was the director of the Atlanta History Museum, and their board actually turned down voting, approving. So they said that the exhibition cannot come here. When that happened, Jimmy went to the press, called them cowards, liars, and said that, you know, just the same way that Dr. King couldn't, you know, get a hearing in this city after he won the Nobel Prize. So there's a bit of hyperbole. But one of the things that Rick Baird said is, listen, Jimmy has been handling these for 20 years, and we're just getting familiar with them. And I thought that was an important thing to say. I mean, I've been touching these and looking at these for a long time. And we've got to realize that, you know, other people need some time with them.
This is such a fascinating story, and I think that when I hear you talk, what I think about is the power of public history.
Yeah.
And the power in many senses, emotional power, but also the power to create discomfort and unrest.
Sure.
And so, I mean, there are other exhibits that have, obviously, there are a number of other
Holocaust Museum,
but you know, or the Smithsonian with, you know, the Gale trying to tell the story.
Right.
And I know you've thought about that a lot, and I wonder if you could just talk a little bit about that kind of the sort of context that this falls into. I mean, it's partly African American history and the issues of showing images or even remembering and and recovering and all of that. But then it's also something about, in this democracy, which we supposedly have free speech, these kinds of public presentations are so fraught.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And you know, what I'm really studying is their fraught aspect. But there is something else. There is, I keep calling it a kind of protean exhibit. There are times when they seem extraordinarily easily wrapped up in the mantle of America. Remember that little series, Touched by an Angel? Well, remember with you know, where an angel comes in and you guys are too young. Or you were watching more sophisticated things. Touched by an Angel had this lovely Irish actress who would be an angel, and she'd appear some families having a problem. And they actually phoned him and said, we want to use some of these photographs. So they made a little feel-good show about some guy who has this black African American who has this you know, lynched member of their family in the background, and Touched by an Angel will come and fix it. So that's what I mean. So it's both of these things, and actually lynching is, I study memorials. I'm also studying, as I've said before, the history of marking the South, of historical markers in the South, and they're becoming kind of easy now to set up, but what they say is appalling. You know, so part of what, as it becomes mainstreamed, it's so oppositional but yet mainstreamed at the same time. And as it becomes mainstreamed, you know, institutions and civic functions can want to sort of tell a teleology, you know, oh, we're through this. Whereas Jimmy and many African Americans who come to it want to keep its unsettled, sort of itinerant, sort of guerrilla quality. And the exhibition has both of those things working at the same time. Oh, I'm sorry, you haven't talked yet.
Well, I think I did ask the question, but as a photographer, I think it would be interesting to hear photographers debate the whole idea of how the lynching photographs or the lynching postcards fit into the history of photography. I mean, they were basically taken by white people as kind of funhouse pictures.
Trophy.
You know, as trophies, exactly, you know, but they have been, in a way, transformed in their usage.
That's right.
And how does something move from being almost a joke or a frivolity to being a documentary photograph?
Well, that's it, and
that wasn't the intent at all.
That wasn't the intent, and in fact, African Americans even before this. I mean, who was it? Walter White in the 40s, when he was trying to pass an anti-lynching bill, literally stuck up on the walls of Congress pictures of the murder of the blowtorch murder of Claude Neal. So NAACP has been turning these images around, and Ida B. Wells, in her, you know, early book, sort of had a lynching photograph. that was actually sent to, Matthew, you've got to remind me, who was the one justice who dissented against, we're talking that important civil rights.
Dred Scott.
Not Dred Scott. Yeah, not Plessy versus who was it? Who was the name of the Plessy versus who was the one dissenter in that?
Harlan.
Was sent to Harlan. So a perpetrator sent to Harlan lynching with use of expletives. This is what you and lovers get. And Ida B. Wells put it in her red record.
I wanted to, there's lynching cultures elsewhere in the world.
Yes.
And I'm familiar, I work on some of them in Congo, immediately post-colonial Congo, neo-colonial Congo.
Okay.
And they give me a little bit of insight that make me decide to say that there are two interesting things about these photographs, is that I believe they were used as terrorism to suppress black activism and independence, and they succeeded. And that there is still in our country a feeling of, among many black people, that they have to be very circumspect and very respectable, because otherwise they'll be hurt. People will attack them, and they will, and they will in some places. So then you have this problem that if you show them again, because it isn't over, then you risk, I want them to be shown, of course. You risk redoubling the terror.
Yeah, that's what that was my main.
That's one thing. And then the second thing is that people who don't want them to be seen, who are, there are people and institutions who don't want this kind of information to come out. I'm thinking about the reaction to the information that came out about Anthony Crawford's lynching in Abbeville and South Carolina, and that little film, that they don't want it known that this happened.
Sure.
And because it's extremely terrible.
It's
reprehensible. But one thing that you really brought out that I thought was so intriguing, which I also have encountered previously, is the potency, the sublime ability of vernacular artists, or vernacular savants, like
thank you for that.
I think there's a really interesting parallel in the story about the exhibit and in the fact that these are postcards. And that is that with postcards, they move through space to different into different people's hands.
That's right.
And the meanings of that object then changes.
That's right.
And I think you're telling a similar story with sort of the politics of the movement of the ownership of this exhibit. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that's absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, the whole politics and it's a chameleon project. It changed Jimmy Allen. I mean, and it changed me. And this book comes shrink wrapped. You got to make a decision when you buy it to literally take your fingernail and break that seal. And that to me says a lot about this history. At the same time, I have to say this, that we've also got to be careful about this becoming kind of runaway metaphor for everything bad, that's happening. Because just as you talked about, historians are still debating what you're describing in Congo are those lynching practices. And I for one feel that we need to be very careful about what we call lynching. We can talk about racial violence continuing, but I personally don't feel, from what I've read sociologically, that we have any more lynchings today. Now I know, Jimmy and
there are in Africa.
We could talk about that and discuss it. Yeah, Madhu.
No, I just, I completely see the point of what several people have said about the repression of that history, or the desire to not have it represented or exhibited. But it seems like one of the more unprecedented, phenomena now in the post-civil rights period is exactly the opposite, which is the desire to exhibit, the desire to actually officialize and see it. And so that somehow seems to me the much more disturbing thing to reckon with in the present.
That's exactly it.
It's repression.
Right, because I begin with objects that people pay a lot of money for and they disappear.
And even when you talked about the book as a coffee table object, like I know of, people who are chief executives at banks who went out and bought the book, and and so it is really serving a whole other kind of.
Yeah.
So the problem isn't that we don't want to face that history, but
It's almost.
which we really do want.
That's exactly it, and we don't, and desire has we have no control of the various kinds of desires for looking, huh? So you're absolutely right. Yeah. By the way, I need to say congratulations. We've got a superstar in our department who's just won an NEH fellow. I mean, those are.
Featured in Red Eye.
That's it. I mean, I thought, we're Thomas Pynchon. I've never laid eyes on anybody who's won one of those awards, like Thomas Pynchon and Toni Morrison. But anyway, this is Rich. Thank you. Congratulations, Roger Reeves, Professor Reeves. Go ahead.
I have a question for you.
Yes.
Particularly, I can't help but think about, there's a scholar here in the history department, Corey Capers, who talks about the traffic of black bodies.
Yes.
Right, and the way in which we traffic black bodies via print and even through scholarship, right? And there's a way in which the book is a re-trafficking of black bodies, right?
Yeah.
And in a lot of ways that are similar to, and so I can't help but think about how do we as scholars, as we're trying to sort of ethically engage this, what are the sort of politics of that ethics, and how do we sort of create scholarship and nuanced analysis of it that also is thinking about how we are participating in this, right? So I was just wondering, how are you thinking about that? How does that inform, right? Like literally, you're sort of talking about the curating of these bodies, like we're putting these bodies up on the wall, we're putting this body in this position.
Well, it's such an important question, and I'm still working with it even after 13 years, and that's why I retreat to the genre of biography. I just think that telling the story, and there's so many stories to be told, like the Frank Embry photographs, the ones of the only victim who's alive, who's whipped. I mean, those are so stunning that they literally became the object of, anytime they were, the object of the kind of, mise en scene of the exhibit. To a point where Jimmy, not reading any of the stuff that we read, just said, I'm not showing those anymore. Like if a newspaper came and wanted to show some photographs, he would not allow them to be. And at one point, he said sort of very simplistically, but he said, the only people who can write about this, I think, are black women. That picture of Frank Embry. So he has this sort of natural intelligence to know that something was wrong in the consumption of those three images. And there's a whole story that I have to get to as the biographer of this book, because those three photographs cost $30,000. And I'll tell you what happened. They were up for auction somewhere. Okay? Now these things come up for auction. Not on each. You can get some of these on, but these were rare. They came up on auction. And he was leaving the country, and he put a bid that he thought would cover it. When he got back, he was outbid by somebody, and he had to go back and beg that man he says, I'm making a collection, I need these things, and the guy just
Gave him.
said, just up how much are you prepared to pay?
Oh, yeah.
Pimped him. But then there's a whole big pimping, I guess, to use the vernacular of some of my wonderful students here, which I always say is theirs and not mine, around the whole project. And that's part of the story too. I would like to interview the guy who bought those. What do you do with three pictures of a naked, tortured black man? And then Cheryl Findley, when we both had a fellowship at Cornell, said that she's an art historian there. There was she used to be an art dealer in New York, and there is a traffic in white, sort of privileged gay circles for naked black men. Of course, I didn't know anything. And I'm not saying there's anything, this is just a story. This is a story, okay? So, I'm the scribe at this point. I am thinking about these things. I have to say this, I'm not any more concerned about, I think the worries that you have, improper curation can be alleviated. What I am concerned about are these eBay things. That they float around, they disappear. We've come to no national consensus about what is our cultural archive, what things we shouldn't sell. I mean, I'm concerned that these images are just in somebody's library, and they're not available anymore, and they've disappeared. And that's another thing.
And if they were known, their families might not permit them to be exposed in public that way.
Who are these people?
But because they've been separated from their families in a vicious way, that's not possible. So that's another issue.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So all of this is part of it.
But wasn't that happening in the original before Jimmy bought them when he went from...
That's the thing.
Right, so it's a continuation just online, you know. They were floating around.
Right. But let me put as a corollary the Holocaust Museum. Here's what goes on. When the Holocaust Museum, and I am going to talk to the people there, when they got there, you could sort of guilt out the German government to get your stuff for free. That's not happening in the African American world. For example, the place where Emmett Till had his tragic confrontation with Mrs. Bryant, that's still existing in Mississippi. And I think Lonnie Bunch, who is starting a Smithsonian African American Museum, wants to buy it. Do you know that family has said, you're not going to get this unless I get $1 million for that?
The other thing is that after World War II, Holocaust photographs were not shown in newspapers and Life magazine for a number of years because it was considered that the American public couldn't take seeing the horrific images.
And also the survivors community didn't want
shown, because in growing up in England, I remember as a child there was
not until around
footage.
1958.
No, you would have seen footage that right after the sort of liberation. There was footage from newsreel. I'm sure they were. They were shown on TV.
Not the newsreels before movies.
Yeah. So they'd be, and then, there was a moment of silence and consideration, and now.
But is anybody speaking up and saying black people's bodies should not be shown because...
Or if we do, we don't have the proper language to speak it. Like the Quentin Tarantino thing, I think, is stupid. I haven't seen the film, but like, for example, those little collectible dolls, they've now banned them. And confession, I actually went and got some. They're coming to me. I bought, well, no, but I want to.
What dolls of what?
The dolls of Django, that there's now, but they're not made to be playthings. They're made to be collector's items. I'm sorry, I thought you meant like, why are you buying that? No, well, what are they? There were some collector's dolls that were part of Django. And, I haven't seen the film, but, we can, that's what we in the English department do. We can talk about genre. We can talk about, but, because this history's been so repressed, we don't have, and Jimmy's very good at this, a public language to talk about, what is a revenge fantasy and, what is history. We're not very...
I think the fact that he's gay has an awful lot to do with that, and it lent a lot of power to his... I was amazed by the commentary.
Yeah.
Because one of his quotes was very powerful. He says, "Polar grief over all my fears," which is both about grieving, so identification in that way, but identification on a basic primordial level of just being frightened. Because, if you're gay, okay, things might be a lot better than they were a while ago, but...
And if you're gay in the South, it's a whole different thing. You're absolutely right. He believes that. But he hasn't always been smart about incorporating, as a white male, the narrative of being gay with this. Sometimes it sort of comes across as sort of too much of a parallel. But his instincts are right.
It's not about parallels, it's about kind of...
No, you're absolutely right.
And also, I think basically about a lot of them, I mean, my own indignation about a lot of this stuff comes from the, experience of bullying.
Yeah.
Because this is about bullying writ large.
Yeah,
and, growing up gay in England or America or wherever, it was all about that bullying. So, you want to scream back at some point.
Okay, well, I will take your call. Yeah, please, yeah. And then we'll go out and we can continue this with some libations, which I really did right now.
I was just, is the thing that makes the photographs / postcards that, let's say, represses those histories, is it circulation? That when they're photographs, they're held in kind of private possession. Like, now they're in these sort of homes and God knows what they're doing there. When they're postcards, it's weirdly roguish because it is that which if it was a photograph, would be private, kept in the house, but it's now kind of in the public.
They were sent in the mail, in fact, yeah, and then
the U.S. postcards.
That they were until they were African Americans sort of insisted that. And remember, the postmasters are in many of these counties are African Americans. They were the recipients of whatever leftover of Reconstruction federal jobs. They're African Americans, so they were sent through the mail as aspects of as forms of terror, and so they change with time, with our shifting notion of racial civil rights. I mean, Jimmy gets called, the library fielded calls saying, I was going through Grandpa's attic and I saw something and I don't know what to do with it. Can I give it to this collection? And so Jimmy has acquired things that way. Guilt, because there are no longer things to be celebrated, exactly. So it's a complicated, it's a complicated and constantly evolving journey and sort of process of circulation. So you're absolutely right, and that's the fascinating thing.
It's a form of circulation that is not public, but then the exhibition kind of keeps that standing.
That's it. But the exhibition takes place in a whole different racial semiotics.
Right.
Yeah. But have multiple meanings. The African American workers at were afraid. They felt, suppose some Klan guy comes in here, or suppose some black guy comes in and walks in and gets violent. What am I going to do with this? This is the King's story. The King's story is one of, we were subjugated, we had a hero. They were used to telling a particularly shaped narrative, and Without Sanctuary was not part of that historical shape.
Well, let's thank Natasha and John.
Thank you. You've given me a lot to think about.